Hello, world. Happy Webinar Wednesday. It's Dr. Deborah Thompson here from One Health Lessons, and it's an absolute pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Joshua Edwards. He is a professor of pharmacology at Midwestern University in Illinois in the United States. Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards, for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. So we met just a few weeks ago, and once we started talking, I had to stop you and say, wait a second, we need to record this conversation, because the things that you were saying were just setting off alarm bells in my head. And I thought this would be fantastic to share with the rest of the world. So for the benefit of people who don't know you, do you mind introducing yourself, please?
Sure. I'm a professor in the pharmacology department at Midwestern University. I received my PhD at Michigan State University. And from there, I went right to Midwestern University to do my postdoc in the laboratory of Walter Projalek. He was doing cadmium research. My PhD thesis work was in metal toxicology, methyl mercury, and transitioned over to cadmium in my postdoc, going from in vitro to in vivo model systems. So I came here as a postdoc, again, in 2004, and then an opening came open for a faculty position in 2007. So I applied and got this faculty position, and then sort of moved up the ranks ever since 2007, and as a tenure track faculty member.
Interesting. Well, when you were a child, did you ever think you would be teaching pharmacology at such a, I would say Midwestern has definitely a One Health mindset. So that's my first question. When you were a child, did you ever think that? And then the second question is, can you explain a little bit more about the philosophy behind, Midwestern? What do you mean by a One Health mindset?
So in terms of my childhood, I was the first person in my family to go to college, actually. So the last thing I was thinking about was actually being a teacher. I went to undergraduate and also at Michigan State University, thinking that somehow I would get an undergraduate degree in zoology, because I didn't just love animals, but I really liked reptiles and amphibians and thermal regulation of reptiles for some reason. I don't know why, but it's just one of these amazing things that I wanted to research and do more work on. And again, as an undergraduate, as a recent graduate, I didn't realize what I was getting myself into. And so I couldn't get a job, doing that sort of research I wanted to do. I didn't realize I needed a PhD. And so I did a master's degree in environmental physiology, looking at freeze-tolerant frogs in South Dakota. Then I came back and started the PhD program in pharmacology at Michigan State University. So it was a very roundabout way to get into pharmacology. And then at that point in my life, in my career, I realized, I really do want to stay in academia. I want to teach. I really enjoyed that. So it was a very convoluted path that I took to do that, to get to this point, to be a teacher. But I'm very happy and very satisfied with what I can do and what I do on a daily basis.
Interesting. And you mentioned for your master's, I think you said it was in environmental physiology?
Environmental physiology. So we're looking at the physiology of freeze-tolerant chorus frogs. Pseudacarus triceriata, I believe this is a species name, but it's a frog that freezes solid. In South Dakota, winters are very harsh, and they would freeze solid and survive. And so the whole idea was, how do they do this? How do they are they able to freeze and still survive and get out in the springtime and be back to normal after that? So that was sort of the idea of that research project. There was like one lab in the whole United States, this is in the late 90s, that was doing that sort of research. And so that was of all the things I guess I could have went into, that was one of them. I was transitioning, I think, from my undergraduate purely animal physiology research to going into this pharmacology area of research. But yeah, it was a really interesting master's thesis and really cool project.
Holy moly, that's fascinating. And I've never before heard the term environmental physiology.
Well, yeah, environmental physiology, how animals deal with their environment. In harsh conditions typically is what you think of. So freeze tolerant amphibians, salt water, with various species that tolerate high amounts of salt and salinity. So yeah, there's all things of like that. Again, I think of course, the freeze tolerant amphibians that I worked with as an example of environmental physiology. But yeah, it's definitely a small group, a small area of research. But yeah, it's really interesting to me.
It makes me think of the people who could read this research and who work with like biomechanics or engineering in that field, and how that could advance medicine, or how that could influence future mechanical, robots or whatever. There's so much to learn amongst each other, even though you were saying it's such a niche
Yes.
section, but wow, so much to offer from that knowledge.
Well, there's actually a book published. I'm totally blanking on the name of this. Life's Devices. There we go. I remember it now. So Life's Devices is a book that's about sort of the physics of flight, and how a bird's wing is shaped a certain way to help it fly in terms of physics. And so that is a really good resource for what you were just talking about. So yeah, this is a book. It was published again in the 90s, mid 90s or so, I think. But yeah, Life's Devices. It's really a cool book.
Yeah, you and I were both alive then. I'm not sure about some of this audience, but that's okay. So you're at Midwestern University. I was introduced to you through somebody from, what is his sector? Microbiology?
Microbiology,
Yeah.
immunology department. Yeah.
But it seemed like everybody spoke with everybody else in that building. So could you explain a little bit what the layout of your university is like and how people collaborate?
Sure. So the basic sciences departments are located within the building of basic sciences building, and there's interactions. There's more, I would say, email-based interactions more so than personal walk up to the hallway, although that does happen, obviously. But we moved here in 2011. Prior to then, we were in a much smaller, compact building where we had even more collaborations and more interactions with each other. But ever since 2011, we have this relatively larger building that we're in. And but yeah, people, if they have an interest in doing something, and it involves a procedure or a cell line or something that somebody else is using, there's a free and equal, sort of flow of information, and people will help each other out, and let them use their whatever. If they're isolating islets, they can borrow islets, or if they're doing whatever cell technique or whatever preparation they're making in the lab, let other people use. It's no problem.
Yeah, it sounds like a great environment.
It is. It really is. Yeah.
So before we get into the nitty gritty of what we were really talking about the other week about toxins and things like that, I wanted to hear, how did you first get introduced to the concept of One Health, or when did you first hear the term? Do you remember?
It was gosh, maybe 5 or 6 years ago now. Midwestern University was going up for its university-wide accreditation. We had just started a veterinary school in our Arizona campus, and One Health, and we talked about this before, but One Health is veterinarians are big proponents of One Health, and the whole idea is to spread it out further. And for me as an environmental toxicologist, one of the 3 pillars of One Health: environment, animal health, and human health. And the environment health is there, and it's like a 3-legged chair. When you take out one leg, that doesn't work as a chair anymore. So that's really where I came in with One Health, because I'm an environmental toxicologist, looking at environmental exposures to things like cadmium, which is an environmental toxicant, using animal models of human health. That all in one study, you get all 3 pillars being involved, I think, with One Health. And so, but I think with the university, it was back in, again, I want to say 2014, 2000, maybe 12, maybe even back then, where they introduced this idea as like, okay, what about if we, as a university, get behind this idea of One Health? And so again, as someone who does environmental toxicology, it was really up my alley, I guess, to kind of run with it. And for me, emphasis is really on the environment and the impact the environment has on human and animal health.
Yeah, absolutely. If we don't have a healthy environment, then everything else falls down. That's
Right.
what it is. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yep.
definitely. Once I heard that you were from the environmental sector, I'm like, oh, we need to record this. And I think I told you before being a vet, I took a lot of ecology classes. I was this close to becoming an ecologist. So it's definitely holds a special place in my heart. That's for sure.
If I could do it again, so I didn't mention this, but in my career path, I was also intern at the Fish and Wildlife Service for a year. And so I luckily landed this internship as a recent graduate with a bachelor's degree in zoology to be able to do this. And it was an amazing project. It was amazing experience for that year, going to Louisiana, Sabine National Wildlife Refuge. I was able to see so many different animals and really study ecology. And that was, a different career path, maybe a second career path. I don't know for me, but maybe doing something along those lines later on in life, maybe something like that. It's a little more low key, but it's a really amazing thing to study ecology and just to, but when you're out in it doing the field work, it's just an amazing feeling.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's jump to toxins. And you mentioned cadmium.
Yep.
What does the general public need to know about cadmium?
Well, cadmium is present in cigarette smoke. That's the most common source, non-occupational source of cadmium exposure. It's in cigarette smoke. Tobacco plants take up the cadmium from the soil and it becomes concentrated in the leaves. Of course, when you smoke tobacco leaves, once they dry and you smoke them, or I guess you're chewing them as well. But especially with smoking, you absorb roughly 50% or half of the cadmium present within that leaf, tobacco leaf. Now, on the flip side, some of the foods we consider healthy can also contain high amounts of cadmium through the same process. So sunflower seeds, for example, can contain very high amounts of cadmium. They're grown in certain areas of North Dakota that just they're high in cadmium content, the soil is, due to natural volcanic activity. And so it's high in cadmium content. And so sunflowers especially are good at sort of concentrating the cadmium from the soil into their seeds. And so what companies will have to do is sort of get sunflowers grown in soil that's not as high in cadmium to sort of cut the sunflower seeds that are high in cadmium to get an acceptable level of cadmium in their product. So that's something that.
So are you saying that cadmium's not good for people?
It's not good for people. No. It's not good for people. Well, and I think as we were in our previous conversation, we were talking about how, with cigarette smoke, 50% is inhaled. When you inhale it, you absorb 50% of that. Whereas with sunflower seeds and other vegetables that might contain cadmium in their leaves, when you eat them, only about 5%, roughly 5% of that cadmium is absorbed. So it's not the same as cigarette smoke, but again, cigarette smoke is the major source of cadmium exposure, and you can see differences in cadmium in the urine of smokers versus non-smokers. So it's definitely indicative of smoking, and it's a very long half-life too. It has a half-life of roughly 30 years inside the kidney. It tends to be concentrated within the kidney ultimately after it becomes metabolized. It becomes deposited there, and again, for years and decades, it can stay there for a very long time.
For the benefit of the audience, a half-life is pretty much how long it stays in a body or in a form until it disintegrates.
Right, and so a half-life, so one half-life, it's 30 years. If you're exposed to 1 milligram of cadmium when you're 10, by the time you're 40, it's down to 500 micrograms. That's a half of that milligram. So half of it will be gone in 30 years. So it's a very long time to get rid of this stuff once you're exposed to it. And that's probably one of the problems. You accumulate this stuff over time, and and studies have shown that, when you get in your 50s and 60s, 50s, essentially, you get the plateauing effect of cadmium, where you get just, again, an accumulation over your lifetime, over the years, and kind of plateaus them around 50 years of age or so.
What does cadmium do to the body? You said it collects the kidneys, but what does that mean for people?
So it accumulates within the kidneys and cause kidney dysfunction, proteinuria. It can cause chronic kidney disease. So it can cause all sorts of nephrotoxic effects. It can also cause the damage to the liver as well. Once it's first absorbed in the body, it can be metabolized in the liver. Those metabolites that contain cadmium are then released from the liver, that can then accumulate again in the kidney. Now, my research has been on the pancreatic islet, and seeing how pancreatic islets can accumulate cadmium in animal models of exposure. And what we've shown is that, especially in our in vitro studies, where we have an isolated islet and we dose very small, 1 micromolar amounts of cadmium onto this islet, insulin release is greatly impaired. So insulin release due to glucose stimulation is greatly impaired once that cadmium is present, and again, at very low micromolar concentrations. So that's what one of the dangers is, that cadmium can be associated with or cause type 2 diabetes. That's one of the active areas of research that's going on right now. Most of the studies out there say, yes, there is an association, but there's some other studies that do not show a significant association. So again, it's an active area of research.
You covered so much just there, and let me just translate it a little bit for the general audience. So the kidneys are responsible for a whole lot of things. It keeps the minerals in your body that should be staying in your body. It kicks out the rest that you don't want. It's responsible for making sure that you stay well hydrated. It helps maintain your blood pressure. I mean, it helps make sure you're not becoming anemic, like low red blood cell count. It's an important organ. Then the liver that you were mentioning before, that's responsible for metabolizing different medications, helps transition like nutrients to advance energy in your body, helps stimulate blood sugar and things like that. And then you mentioned the pancreatic islet cells, which is like the factory of blood sugar, of insulin that brings the blood sugar into the cells.
Right.
So
it does.
Now we're talking about the pancreas and the islet cells that produce the insulin. And then can you just recap why that's important with cadmium and all that?
Well, cadmium, again, there's some studies showing that it is associated with type 2 diabetes. So when it comes to diabetes, especially adult onset or type 2 diabetes, we know genetics plays a huge factor. We know the diet and exercise, habits of people plays a huge role, especially exercise and diet. But the environment, the fourth factor here is the environment. And so because cadmium is an environmental toxicant, there's evidence, again, there's good evidence, a lot of studies showing that there's an association between cadmium exposure and diabetes, adult onset diabetes. And so that's what we're looking at, is how is this happening, or why is this happening? And there are other researchers focusing on other areas of the body, but I'm focused in on the pancreatic islets.
Wow. Wow. So we're talking about a toxin in the environment. It seems to be ever present.
It is. It's also contained in well water, some parts of the United States where, again, just due to natural coincidences or presence within the crust, well water can contain elevated levels of cadmium. But it's, again, primarily for people who are not working in smelters or some sort of mining or smelting industry. For those non-occupational exposures, it's cigarette smoke is by far the biggest source of exposure with cadmium.
Interesting. And I know for years there's been mention about cigarette smoking and diabetes, and then what are the confounding factors? There are so many variables. So we have to think about the environment too. What are we
Yep.
putting into our bodies?
Yep, exactly. And there's so many, I mean, my gosh, with cigarette smoke, I think there's over 200 different compounds that are released from cigarette smoke. And so, I mean, try to, just factor that in. It's just so many different things. And we do know that cadmium is dangerous as a toxin, but cigarette smoke is the major primary cause of this, but of exposure. But again, we don't know the exact role that cadmium has. Again, something like type 2 diabetes. And so it's an active area of research.
Wow, fascinating. So with that being said, you have beautifully summarized really One Health, thinking about how the environment can have, a toxin like cadmium there, and then how it can concentrate in the leaves of tobacco plants. And then while we smoke it, 50% gets into us, and it can affect the kidneys, the liver, the pancreas, and can possibly increase our risk of having diabetes later on in life due to our actions. So yeah, that's a beautiful One Health example right there. And I'm wondering, for the audience, oftentimes it's younger One Health advocates, people who are just starting off in their careers, coming from the environmental toxicology section, the pharmacology sector. Any pieces of advice for our audience members?
I would just say, in terms of research and going in the lab and collecting data, just go where your heart goes, where your passion is, follow that, do what you want to do. In terms of what you think is meaningful research, and you'll be happy. You want to be happy in life. And I think that's for a researcher doing anything related to environmental health, that's what, if that makes you happy, then do that, go there and do that. And with academia, you get that freedom. I feel like you can do that. And, of course, try to get funding, of course, for your project as well. But yeah, just try to, go where your passion lies and really enjoy what you're doing.
Excellent advice. Thank you so much, Dr. Edwards, for this time together. It's been such a pleasure to see you again.
Good. Me too. I'm happy to see you as well.
Well, onwards and upwards. I'll see you all next week.